Hello, my name is Eha Emilia Oras, and I'm a junior researcher at Tallinn University, which basically means I'm doing my doctorate, but I'm also an employee. And I'm in my first year, and my topic is studying the queer history in interwar Estonia. So also hello from your distant cousins at the coast of the Baltic Sea. And me and my wife have been in the city since the day before yesterday, and it's really quite lovely. And maybe a little too lovely, because I was exploring the city instead of practicing this presentation. But regardless, I would like to thank the organizers for bringing me here or extending the invitation. And yeah, I will hopefully be able to tell you about the queer community in Estonia, both the past, the present, the good, and the bad, and so forth. But before I begin, I feel the need to point out some things. Estonian queer history is still a kind of an unresearched subject. It got started in like 15 years ago or so. So I'm what you might call the second generation researcher. And a lot of what I'm going to tell you is based off of the research done by other people. And unfortunately, a lot of this material is not available in English, though I would like to highlight Rebecca Pultsam's PhD thesis, which is in English, and it has a lot of it's very up to date. She got her PhD last year, if I'm not mistaken, and she has all the literature that's relevant to the topic, and from there you can find the ones that are in English. I wasn't going to start listing them all here. It would get a little muddled. And I would be also remiss if I did not mention the book that's pictured there, Kalevi alt välja, which documents the stories of LGBT plus people from the 19th and 20th century, which I have also used a lot for this presentation. My own research has been mainly concentrated on the interwar period, as I said, so 1918 to 1940. And the focus is how state and medical apparatuses interacted with queer people. And I'm still early in my research. I haven't published anything, but hopefully I'll have an article coming out later this year. And yeah, now a note on terminology. What do words mean? It's actually more complex than you might imagine, because all the words in the title of my presentation could be argued over for hours, and I in fact do that. In 5 days I'm going to have a conference presentation on the meaning of words, especially or how to use words, specifically the words used for queer people in the past, and how do we use them in the present. To make it as easy as possible, so when I say Estonian, I more mean in the geographic sense. So anyone who lived in the area of modern-day Estonia, which isn't just ethnic Estonians, it's also other people. And when I say queer, I mean anyone whose gender or sexuality buck the norms of their time and place. The people themselves probably would not have identified with the label queer, or maybe even the idea behind it, but I have to use some kind of terminology, and I'm going to use that. I will of course love any questions and remarks, though I would ask that you keep that for the end of the presentation. Though if there are any clarifying remarks or I'm not making much sense, please do let me know, and I'm happy to clarify. And finally, a short introduction to Estonia. Estonia, for those not in the know, is a small country on the shore of the Baltic Sea, the east coast of the Baltic Sea. East we have Russia, down we have Latvia, and across the sea we have Finland and Sweden. And so we're quite a small nation. And while unfortunately we're not anywhere important, we're on the way to everywhere important. So the area that now encompasses Estonia has changed hands quite a lot in our history, which is not too dissimilar to Hungary, I think. For us, history really kicked off, so to say, in the 13th century with the Northern Crusades, during which Crusaders, mainly German, Christianized and colonized the country. And for the next 700 years, we were ruled by Baltic Germans, who formed the political, economic, and cultural upper class of the area now known as Estonia. But they weren't exactly in control of the area as the area changed hands quite a bit between Sweden, Denmark, Russia, and Poland, Lithuania, and whoever else. And finally, after World War I, we managed to get our own nation. The first time Estonia was on a map as an independent nation. That lasted for 22 odd years until World War II kicked off and we got occupied by the Soviets. And then for 50 years we were occupied, and then we managed to regain independence, and ever since then we've been independent, which is, again, not too dissimilar to Hungary, probably. Since the collapse of the USSR, Estonia has done relatively well for itself. We have our problems, much like anyone else, especially with the war in Ukraine kicking off. But for the most part, it's been okay. But I'll talk more about the current situation later. So I'm going at this chronologically. Now with those out of the way, I'm actually going to start talking about my topic. So those of you that read the description of the event might remember my lament at the lack of queer history sources from the time period prior to the middle of the 19th century. There are only a sparse few examples, which isn't all that surprising considering we don't have that much source material to begin with. And one example I'd like to highlight, however, is that the case of Jan. Jan, which is basically the equivalent of the English John, or the Slavic Ivan, which is the most generic male name you can think of. In today's terms, he would be considered intersex. When he was born in 1661 in a small village in North Estonia. I put the map there. I don't think you can see, but there's a circle around the farm that he was born in. However, he was assigned female at birth. However, as he grew up, he developed male secondary sex characteristics, so a beard, a low voice, the genitalia, and obviously he wasn't very happy with having female on his papers, so he wanted to fix those papers. While the process was troublesome and complicated for obvious reasons, he did manage to have himself recognized as a man. The change was announced by the parish priest, and it was thereafter punishable by a fine to dead name him or remind him of his prior life. So the church did in fact penalize dead naming someone. He later petitioned for permission to marry, though unfortunately that petition was denied. His fate thereafter, at least to me, remains unknown. Now I'm going to jump forward 200 years or so to 1850, to the first known, emphasis on the word known, legal prosecution of homosexuality in the areas of modern-day Estonia. The case did not actually involve ethnic Estonians, but two of those Baltic Germans I mentioned earlier. They were upperclassmen, but in 1850 they were brought to trial for, in the vocabulary of their day, sodomy and pederasty. Fortunately for them, they weren't caught in the act, but rather there were accusations or rumors against them, and while the court was already going to rule in their favor probably, they opted for having medical examinations. Now, you might very justifiably ask how a doctor would medically determine whether someone has been having same-sex relations. Well, they had criteria. They were, after all, men of science. Here we get into the ideas that were prevalent about homosexuality at the time. And there were different criteria for people who would be considered active and passive parts in the coitus. The passive party was expected to be younger or young, immature boy or young man, identifiable by their flabby body, atrophied muscles, wrinkly skin, hunched posture, weak knees, unsteady and wobbly walk, dull eyes, bad hearing, and an inflated sphincter. The active participant was expected to be an older man with a pale and inflamed face exhibiting signs of exhaustion and losing weight due to an inordinate amount of orgasming. Their sexual organ was expected to be small and thin, which has caused them to not receive satisfaction when engaging with the opposite sex, which has made them turn to homosexuality. As a result of this, they might also appear hostile to the opposite sex. The descriptions of the genitalia are in fact quite graphic, but I didn't put them here because they are very explicit and rather disgusting. Now, if you think all of this sounds absurd, you would be right. Even back then, people were rather skeptical about how much you could trust a process like this. Nonetheless, examinations like this would keep going well into the 20th century. But these two gentlemen were found not to possess these characteristics, or at least not possess them in the sufficient quantity that needed for a positive identification, I suppose. So they were found not guilty. If they had been found guilty, however, they would have faced exile to Siberia. No, that isn't just a Soviet thing. The Russian Empire also really likes sending people to Siberia, which was a much kinder fate than they would have received a few years earlier with the old penal codes, which would have condemned them to death. Now, since they weren't actually convicted and they never confessed for obvious reasons, we don't actually know if anything happened or not. They might have been totally innocent. They might not have done anything at all. But this is still an important thing to mention. Okay. We can, however, be much more certain of the proclivities of another Baltic German man, Elizar von Kupfer, who might be called Estonia's Tom of Finland, except when Tom had a proclivity for hypermasculine hunks. Elizar much more preferred hyperfeminine, elfish twinks. I don't know if you can see, but yeah. He was a man of many, mostly artistic talents. But I'm not going to talk too long on him because, firstly, I think the visual materials are much more enticing, so feel free to Google him. He's certainly unique in his style. And secondly, he's rather ethereal to the topic at hand. But I would be remiss to not mention him because he's rather notable, and I also quite like that description of him by Ben Miller of the Bad Gays podcast, which I also recommend highly. And plus, he's one of the few gays to have a relatively happy ending, dying at age 70 in Switzerland in a villa with his long-term partner. And well, that's something to celebrate, I suppose, even if he wasn't the most nice person. Now, the reason he could be relatively open about his homosexuality was that the era in which he lived, the turn of the 19th and 20th century, was very big on change. A lot of stuff shifted. And one of these changes was in matters of sexuality being brought more to the fore of public attention. both in a sensationalist manner, newspaper coverage and such, but also in a reformist sense, in that people were now pushing for a less negative scientific understanding of homosexuality and gender variance. If you've heard about Magnus Hirschfeld, which I'm sure a lot of you probably have if you're at this presentation, then he was at the forefront of that movement. Another change was with the drastic increase in Estonian language media. There was a need for vocabulary to describe these matters, as before it just didn't exist. The room was all in German or Latin or Russian or whatever. Due to the lingering effects of Puritan prudishness, the attempts at this were rather bumbling and filled with euphemisms, and could be described as cute if the context that they were used in weren't so nauseating. When describing homosexual acts between two men, they might use these terms. I don't know if they're visible from the way over there, but hopefully they are. So a little Estonian lesson. And all these phrases are taken from, except for the last one, the gender variance one. All of these above phrases were used at the beginning of the 20th century during the Eulenburg affair, which has the dubious distinction of being the first modern international sex scandal, the first a turning point in open discussions on homosexuality, as well as arguably the birth of modern homophobia. All the gay panics, i.e. conspiracies about nefarious cabals of homosexuals controlling everything, got their start in the Eulenburg affair. That became, due to our very close ties to Germany, we got the German cultural sphere. A lot of that spread to us as well. Maybe not so much the homosexual cabal talk, but all the talk about the homosexuals secretly corrupting the youth and all of that. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This sort of thing became very common after World War I, when in 1918 Estonia gained its independence and became one of the many new nation states in Europe, with our fledgling fragile liberal democracy. As elsewhere in Europe, this was accompanied by a sense of progressivism, the most pertinent aspects of which are here the more free media, so there was less control of the media, as well as bringing questions of queerness into public view. Newspapers latched onto these topics with a fair amount of gusto. A lot of this attention was negative, and stories abounded about those aforementioned older wealthy men, sometimes Baltic Germans, sometimes not, who preyed on younger, often naive Estonian men who had, just didn't know what was going on. The pinnacle of this, so to say, phenomenon was a series of articles in the early 1930s called Lilaudus, or Purple Horror. Which, in my opinion, is a much better name than the Lavender Scare of the American in the 1950s, though they're not comparable situations. Just the name did strike me as kind of similar. These articles detailed experiences of a former homosexual, as he called himself. And while this article is not exactly trustworthy, it does give a lot of insight into what it was like to be a homosexual in that time. Though it does cover the experience of homosexual or bisexual cis men, not much of anyone else. An interesting tidbit from the article, as well as elsewhere, is the story of Richard Waldock, a homosexual priest, first in the Orthodox and then in the Catholic Church, who performed gay marriages at his home. Of course, not official gay marriages, they weren't legal. But as a priest, he performed gay marriages at his home called Teresa's Castle. And the reason for that name is because everybody everybody there was expected to be in drag and have female names. Stories from Estonian print media of the time have been rather captivating to the Estonian queer community, so much so that they made a short film, and I'd love to show you the trailer for that if this works, hopefully. There are some mentions of lesbian or bi women or people who might today be dubbed transmasculine. Those are, however, relatively fleeting. Less fleeting, however, was the case of Eha someone who we would likely refer to as a trans woman. That's her in the picture. And she ended up in the newspapers a lot during the late 1920s and early 1930s, which is why she has been dubbed as the most famous queer person in interwar Estonia. While she did engage with that publicity, being the first openly queer person to give an interview to Estonian media, it wasn't the sort of fame, or rather infamy, that you might crave. The reason she was in the papers was not because she was a socialite, but rather she was but someone whose employment someone who ended up in the papers through let's say the necessities of her life. She was from a very poor family. She didn't have much of an education, so she ended up doing crime, possibly sex work, and the papers really picked up on that, as well as the court cases, and that sort of attention forced her out from the shadows, so to speak, and that's why we know her, which was bad for her, but fortunate for me as a researcher, as selfish as that is to say. And the quote in the title of the presentation, in fact, comes from an interview with her when she was at the psychiatric hospital in Tartu, and she gave that as an answer to the doctor asking about what her reply would be to people who questioned or mocked her identity. Unfortunately, her story did not have a very happy ending. She ended up going back in the closet, so to speak, and just lived out their life and in obscurity, let's say. She wasn't the only person to be subjected to intervention by the medical authorities. In my research thus far, though I'm just beginning, I found a few such examples. One was another trans woman, like Eha, who was committed to a psychiatric clinic on at least 3 separate occasions by her family and forcefully kept there. And the conditions there were not good, and especially for her. She was expected to wear male attire, have a shaved head, and it was an unpleasant experience, to say the least. Another example is that of a homosexual man who turned to a psychiatric clinic for help in regards to his sexual orientation. Though this proved insufficient, as he later sought more hands-on medical intervention and would be subject to conversion therapy. This was alleged to be a success, though he would later pop up in Germany in 1944, ominous, where he would be sent to a concentration camp due to being convicted under the infamous paragraph 175, which sent a lot of people to concentration camps for homosexual activity. Afterwards, I don't really know what happened to him. Though in Estonia, homosexuals did not face the same sort of persecution as they would in Germany, it is important to note that during this whole time, homosexual penetrative sex between men was in fact criminally punishable under the old Russian penal code, which we didn't have our own penal code until 1929 and adopted in 1935, which the one adopted in 1929 did, however, do away with that law, and but the law code was finally adopted in 1935. So we had 5 years before the Soviet occupation, where no queer activity was at least directly criminalized, and the motivation for that, at least partly, was not exactly enlightened, though there might have been elements of that, but mostly it was to prevent blackmail. Paradoxically, the adoption of this law code, which decriminalized homosexual relations between men, coincided with a turn to authoritarianism in 1934, and as the president at the time performed a coup. This brought it with its so-called era of silence, which put an end to most public discourse surrounding homosexuality or gender variance. So with homosexuality no longer being criminally penalized, luckily, and the media not being allowed to discuss it, we have precious little source material to say anything about the years directly prior to World War II and prior to 1940. And what happened in 1940? Well, World War II and the Soviet occupation. After Estonia was occupied and annexed into the Soviet Union, their penal code was also brought over, which criminalized homosexual intercourse between men since 1934. So there was a little unfortunate switcheroo where we got rid of our penalization and they brought it, and we ended up with it also. So Estonia went the way of Germany. We had a bit of promise there to be, well, not good, but also not terrible. And instead, we regressed. So the Soviet occupation more or less brought us back to the situation as it was before legalization, except the Soviet Union had much better capabilities to actually enforce these laws than the prior governments. And either Tsarist Russia or the interwar Estonian government. The Soviet Union did have something in common with the latter, though, which was aggressive pronatalism, and both due to that, both pretty rigidly enforced binary gender roles, which also included repressing variances in gender and sexuality. There were efforts made by Soviet legal experts to once more decriminalize homosexuality, though even during the thaw after Stalin's death and up to Gorbachev's time, they were repeatedly ignored and crackdowns continued. Both Soviet politicians as well as ideologues continued to frame homosexuality as a bourgeois trait associated with the West that needed to be pathologized, criminalized, and hidden. So homosexual men had to deal with very intrusive probing by the state, including but not limited to interrogations, raids on their homes, examinations by doctors, such as before, and forensic psychiatrists. In a more roundabout way, they also dealt with the loss of jobs, relationships, and status in society. These dangers did not, however, stop men from seeking intercourse or relationships or even community. And there were communities, hidden of course, but they still existed. Though, interestingly enough, while homosexual men were persecuted, the USSR did offer an avenue to transgender people for medical and legal transition. I know a lot of this is kind of hard to pinpoint because the process was, by its very nature, kept secret. So a lot of this is not exactly well established. But somewhere in the 1970s and 80s, some avenues did open up. The official route was through the Soviet Health Ministry, which had regulations meant to deal with this. The actual process was fucking awful. And so if you stumbled across a doctor that knew that this was a possibility, which was a long shot, since they also didn't really know about this, the doctor would write to the health ministry, and the health ministry would decide whether they would accept you. And if the ministry agreed, you had to go to a psychiatric clinic in either Moscow or southern Russia, where you were kept for an extended period of time, either 3 months, 6 months, a year, or sometimes even more. And the purpose of that stay was to ascertain whether you were mentally well, and you were firm in your identity. And these psychiatric hospitals were little better than prisons, and they would basically do what amounts to torture to try to get these people to crack. And some people did manage to get the approval this way. A lot of people didn't. A lot of people got sent home and had nothing to really show for their efforts. Some people were committed forcefully for a diagnosis such as schizophrenia. And so it was not something you really wanted to go through, or even most people would know that you could go through. A few people in Estonia did go through this process. Unfortunately, there's precious little information about them. And it's important to keep in mind that while this was technically an avenue open to people, the Soviet state did not look kindly upon transgender people, considering trans identity as a pathology and something to be pathologized and treated. So there was an aura of secrecy and fear around the process, which both traumatized the people that went through it, as well as kept people away from engaging with it. And the topic was basically unheard of in public discourse, with the first mentions being in 1990, where an article was published about a Latvian surgeon, Viktors Galnbergs, who performed a series of surgeries on a trans man in the early 1970s, though for that he was reprimanded, because even though the Soviet government found that the surgeries were justified, they still reprimanded him for, I think, not exactly doing everything absolutely by the book. And the case was kept secret for 20 years afterwards. So it was literally a state secret. And until then, much like before, gender nonconformity and female homosexuality went almost entirely unnoticed in public discourse, or unheard. Female homosexuality was fortunately not punished by law, as the people who wrote these laws could not conceptualize how intercourse between two women could take place, something that seems to be quite a universal phenomenon when you study the history of criminalization of homosexual behavior. And it was treated as for mostly a psychiatric issue. The glimpses we got from the media during the interwar period are now more absent, until again the liberalization at the end of the Soviet Union, as these topics was almost entirely I already said this. Okay. So this silence began to change, and during the last years of the Soviet Union, as the country liberalized. So topics surrounding sexuality started to be covered in the media again, thus allowing public discourse on queer topics. Additionally, just like groups were now able to form to push for an independent Estonia, queer people began to organize as well. The queer community in Estonia saw themselves as fighting under the same banner, with the same goals as a nationalist revival movement. Though the nationalists were not very receptive to that, instead often being opposed to the aims of minority groups, queer people among them. But back to the queer organizations. At first they organized separately, with gays, lesbians, and trans people forming their own separate organizations. The first of these organizations was the Estonian Lesbian Alliance, which was not just the first queer organization in Estonia, but also the first queer organization in the Baltics as well. Then there was the Men's Association of Härjapea and the Estonian Gay Alliance. The Bull's Head one came first, but the Gay Alliance came later, and then they eventually joined. That was an organization for gay men. And finally came Gendi, which the name probably gives it away, but it's gender dysphoria, Gendi. And that came in 1993, so within a few short years, there were already organizations representing all of the sort of totality of the queer movement or queer people. These independent organizations were very active in their own pursuits, becoming the first time that Estonia had organizations, groups actively lobbying for the interests of the queer community. And this was even before the Soviet Penal Code was replaced by the one of the newly independent Estonian Republic in 1992, where male-on-male homosexual relations were no longer penalized. So the male homosexual activists who were organizing and putting themselves out there were doing so despite facing a level of danger, which they themselves were very well aware of. This was especially commendable, as this was the time when the HIV/AIDS crisis came to the Soviet Union in 1987. This was the HIV/AIDS crisis was also one of the prompters of continued public discourse around homosexuality. And so they did a lot to mitigate how bad it could have gone with the HIV or AIDS. And doctors in Soviet times were obligated to report homosexual patients, so that also kept a lot of people from reporting, and the organization did a lot to try to circumvent that. The Estonian Lesbian Alliance was very active internationally, creating ties with both Finnish organizations as well as participating in ILGA conferences. First for Estonian queer people, at least those from the home country. I'm unsure about the Estonian queer people from abroad, so the ones that had moved away from Estonia. This did play a part in later professionalization of queer activism through collaborations with other organizations and being able to get funding and help from various international or global organizations. The Estonian trans organization Gendi was the last to be formed, as I said, established by the first person to both medically and legally transition in the newly independent Estonia. And she didn't have an established guideline, but rather she had to basically create the pathway for herself, and she chose to share her knowledge with other trans people, so a pioneer. Unfortunately, the latter would kind of get pulled up after her through no fault of her own, but the two other people managed to go through the process before the judicial ministry caught on that the subdivision that was dealing with this process was operating in a legal gray area. There was no regulations in place to deal with this, so they told them to stop it without actually providing any sort of alternative. After that, the judicial ministry and social ministry got into a spat about who's in charge of the process, who handles what, and what order the process was supposed to take place in. The judicial ministry maintained that you needed to have surgery before you could get your documents changed, but the social ministry said you had to have your papers changed before you could get your surgery, or something to that effect. So essentially, gender transition was for a few years essentially impossible. It wouldn't be until 1999 that there would be official regulations laid out by the government for going through this transition, and it was every bit as demeaning and Kafkaesque a process as you might imagine for that time. De jure, we're still following the same guidelines, even though the current people in charge of it no longer mandate some of the parts of the process, such as genetic testing or other things that I'm not gonna get into. Though now that it isn't quite as bad as before, with some of the hoops being removed, we are now dealing with very long queues, like people who are supposed to wait for 3 months maximum are waiting somewhere around 2.5 years. They are kind of trying to fix it, but it's not really working. But back to the groups I was talking about. Collaboration happened between, to a greater or lesser degree, between all of the organizations, like the Estonian Lesbian Alliance and Gendi collaborating very closely. A lot of the outreach that Gendi was able to do was primarily thanks to the infrastructure that the Lesbian Alliance provided. And Gendi people were welcome at Lesbian Alliance events and so forth. There were also some attempts to get the more official coalition groups going, even as far as back as 1990. But it would take until the 2000s for a united front to form. And at that point, it was no longer really the original organizations doing the uniting. It was their successors, and those successors have also been in turn kind of replaced up to this point. So today we have like one large one. I don't know if I'd call it an umbrella organization, but the Estonian LGBT Association, who were also referred me here, or referred me to the organizers of the event. And so I'm very thankful to them for that. And some relatively smaller and local organizations who all do great work. I'm jumping around the chronology a little, I hope you'll excuse me. Back to the past now. And while the original organizations had previously focused their efforts inwards in the 2000s, they had started doing work outside of the community as well, becoming more visible to the outside world and raising awareness. So while the precursor to Pride in 2003 was a community event with poetry reading, film showings, etc., then in 2004, Tallinn was not only the first, Tallinn not only hosted Estonia's first Pride, but it also hosted the first Pride in the Baltics, Moonbow Pride. Tallinn would have its own Pride celebrations with parades and all until 2007. And after that, they were discontinued primarily because of security concerns, as the last one had gotten violent, as well as community organizers deciding to go in a different direction, with organizing instead trying to influence politicians, do lobbying work, and so forth. And the results of that were not exactly promising, not great. There was, the politicians did make big promises about fulfilling the demands of the community, but in exchange for no more or a public organizing, so to say. And but ultimately, it just ended up being mostly talk. Now, to be fair, we did get some things, like the Registered Partnership Act, so civil unions, even though in 2010 a family law was passed which defined family as between a man and a woman. So it was sort of give and take. And what's worse is the fact that they didn't actually pass the enforcement acts of the civil union, of the Registered Partnership Act. So they were legally, people in civil unions were legally in a legal gray area. They didn't technically have legal rights. So they had to go to court to sort them out, and that was for a good long while. There were still prides, mind you, just that now it was Baltic Pride, organized along with queer communities in Latvia and Lithuania. So Tallinn Pride had a pride every 3 years, though no parades until 2017, which once more then we got parades again, and we've had a parade for in every 3 years, so 2020 and 2023, which was also my first Pride. And we're going to have Tallinn Pride in 2025, and there's also going to be Baltic Pride in Vilnius in Lithuania in 2025, and we would love to see you at both. And we also had in 2024 Tartu Pride, Tartu being the second largest city in Estonia, since Tartu was at that time one of the cultural capitals of Europe. So there was a Pride organized, and we had a pretty good turnout for Estonia. We had a few thousand people, which is, I think, about 10 times less than in Budapest. But for us, it's still good numbers. Both Baltic Pride 2023 and Tartu Pride 2024 were celebrating pretty momentous occasions for Estonia and Eastern Europe in general. Namely that in 2023, we got legal marriage equality passed into law, and it went into effect on the 1st of January 2024. And we finally also got the implementation acts for the civil unions, so for those that wanted them. But with that, we became the first Baltic country, as well as the first post-Soviet country, to get marriage equality. I was a bit late to the party in taking advantage of that. Me and my wife got married in December 2024, I'm sorry, and it's been great, don't get me wrong, but the fight doesn't end at marriage equality. We're still dealing with the same status quo in the treatment of trans people. In the same way that civil unions were a bungled, ad hoc system thrown together to quell unrest among queer people, so is the path to transition. But this system is currently crumbling under its own contradictions, not to mention it being based on outdated notions of transness. So you can forget things such as non-binary recognition, or you're basically either a binary trans person or bust. But we're hoping it's going to crumble sooner rather than later, as later might mean it's going to be built by right-wing lunatics, as the current government, who did do the nice thing of establishing marriage equality, but they've done nothing for trans people really, other than some trans people wanting to marry people of the same gender. But they're probably going to lose the next election because they've just been not the best in governing, and if that government falls, we're probably going to get people who view queer people in the same way as Orban's party does. But if that does happen, we're going to fight them just as hard as you're fighting Orban. To quote Heinz Walk, the person who coined the term singing revolution for Estonia's struggle for freedom, one day we will win no matter what. And that isn't me favoring some sort of Whiggish idea of history, that the arc of history bends towards progress, but rather that they can't get rid of us anymore. We are too aware, too strong, and too united. They can't do to us what they did before, not when they would condemn us to death over sodomy, not when they sent us to prisons or hospitals, not when they burnt our books or dispersed our communities. That used to be the end for us, but not anymore. We are too strong now, our ideas have dug their roots too deep. There are times, of course, when things seem impossible. With the news in the world, it's hard not to think that. But all throughout the history of people that are like us, we've strived towards freedom. The very act of being ourselves is rebellion against those that would seek to silence us or to erase our presence. And their attempts to force us into line become ever more desperate because they are, by their very nature, unnatural. As much as they want to label us as unnatural, it is their need for control that goes against the very foundation of nature. Their tyranny requires constant effort. The oppression that they carry out is the mask of their fear. And one day they will not be able to assert their control anymore, and they will crack. And it's easy for me to tell you how to fight, or to fight. I've never had the cops sicked on me. I've never had the law turned against me. But if studying history has taught me anything, it's that no one ever got their rights by being meek and silent. You have to fight. And it doesn't have to be chucking bricks at them, but letting them know that you exist and that you aren't going anywhere. Your desire to exist is going to outweigh their desire to have you go away every time. And with that, I'm going to end this presentation. Thank you for listening. And I'm now going to totally undercut any pathos that last part might have had. But if somebody has any recommendations for books or arts or anything about Hungarian queer history or anything of that sort, we would love to hear.
Is there a character from Estonian mythology, maybe, who is assumed to be queer, or
queer readings of characters, most notably like are like the mythological character Kalevi Poeg, son of Kalev. There are queer readings of him. Personally, I'm not in the literary sciences, unfortunately. I couldn't give a very in-depth explanation as to that, but there are certainly ways to read queerness into things, and but unfortunately, a lot of our mythology is mostly how to say it 19th century revival sort of things, or folk traditions collected in the 19th century. So we don't have stuff from much earlier. We have tidbits, but not much.
Do you have any kind of subjective or objective or any kind of comment or comment about Estonia before Christianity?
Subjective
about
comment?
Like about the queerness or LGBT, homosexuality.
I have not encountered anything. If it would be archaeological, but I have not seen any indications of anything like that, unfortunately. It would be very cool if there was. I was before I went on to this topic. I was a medievalist, so I'm kind of new to this topic. But if there was like any indication in the medieval record, I would really that would be really cool. Unfortunately, I didn't know any.
So you've mentioned that the major queer organization or LGBT organization in Estonia turned away from organizing to lobbying. Yes. Why was that? Did they find success in that, or was that just a decision on the spur, and did they completely stop organizing?
They didn't stop organizing as such. They still did organization work, even though it went mostly it wasn't as open anymore. But the Pride, the open organizing stopped. Like, for example, the Pride Parade stopped because the last one in 2007 turned violent. There were, I think, there was a bomb threat on the Pride Parade first, and then there were confrontations where I think 5 people were injured. Unfortunately, none of the attackers were prosecuted, and that sort of disheartened people. As far as I understand, I wasn't there. I was all of 11 years old at the time. But that it was partly because of the security concerns, and partly also because politicians or the powers that be decided that it would be, or promised that these changes could be implemented quietly, which they weren't. for unfortunately. So they had to start more publicly organizing, and of course there was also changes in the organizers themselves. Some, moved on. Some had to do other things. Some went to queer organizations in Europe to be on the European level. So it was a bunch of different factors, but eventually they did start, and of course there were still Baltic prides, which did take local organizing as well. The local organizations collaborated on that, and they did the Estonian part of it, and but yeah, and energy had went elsewhere for a while.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.